From the New York Times, this is The New Washington. I'm Michael Barbaro. Today, Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
To the best of my knowledge, I'm the first mom to hold the job of the White House press secretary. I've heard from countless members of the FBI that are grateful and thankful for the president's decision, and I don't even know that many people in the FBI.
Unfortunately, we have a room full of people that refuses to ask questions that America cares about.
I'm happy to say that I directly spoke to the President Dillon, and he would be more than happy to be here for him. The only thing I see misleading is a year's worth of stories that have been fueling a false narrative about this Russia collusion, and I think if we're going to talk about misleading, that's the only thing misleading I see in this entire process. And with that, I'll take your questions.
No, I think that plant's seen better days. It's time to let it go.
What is
so
that?
Oddly, I don't actually know. It was left by the previous administration, and I've kept it alive until like the last month, and then it's just like fallen apart. So I've given up on the plant.
Is that a metaphor?
No, the plant's it didn't make it.
Michael Grimbaum, who did you talk to?
Sarah Huckabee Sanders. She's the new White House press secretary.
And where did you two have this conversation?
We met in her office in the West Wing. They were actually packing up for the renovation. They're all getting kicked across the street for a few weeks. So her office was pretty bare. And I sat across from her desk and turned on my iPhone recorder, and we talked for about 45 minutes.
And there's, I think desperate to kick us out of our space so they can get our stuff out. So I'm like the last holdout here.
Well, I won't keep
There were
you here
cardboard
long.
boxes around,
Copies
of the New York Post.
The New York Post.
The New York Post, President Trump's first read.
So, are you moving into the other room when you guys get back from
Yeah.
about 2 weeks?
And what is her office like?
It's small, so she's going to move into the big press secretary's office where Sean Spicer used to work, but he hadn't yet moved out of the building.
You can expect to see lots of pictures of my kids' artwork.
Yeah.
So tell me about Sarah Huckabee Sanders' job. What does she do?
Good afternoon.
Every day, she walks into the White House briefing room,
Somebody's polite out there.
stands behind a podium, the cameras switch on, and she fields
And with that, we'll keep it short today, and I'll take your questions now.
a dozen, 2 dozen questions from a pretty aggressive pack of reporters.
Was he making a joke about police brutality?
What's the delay? You guys have had this since Friday.
Is this what is hurting the president's legislative agenda, this credibility issue on the Hill?
I think what's hurting the legislative agenda is Congress's inability to get things passed.
That's, say, 45 minutes.
Thanks, guys. We've got a small business event coming up shortly.
The rest of the day is spent talking to a lot of journalists from the moment she gets up at 5 a.m. to when she goes to bed, answering questions from reporters from news outlets all around the world. What does the administration think of this event, this world crisis? She's essentially the first point of contact at the Trump administration for journalists.
Michael, you spoke to Sarah Sanders before the events of the last week, and this seems to be an especially interesting week to be talking about and hearing from the president's press secretary.
This egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
Steve Bannon is now out at the White House.
And it feels notable that in one of the most controversial, maybe even the most controversial week of the presidency, his press secretary basically hasn't spoken.
So by tradition, when the president is on vacation, there aren't regular press briefings.
And the president is on vacation.
He's in New Jersey. But at a moment like this, that feels like a defining moment for this president, you would expect to see the press secretary out on the airwaves, talking to Anderson Cooper, going on Fox News, giving the president's perspective, defending his remarks, explaining to the American people why he behaved this way in the aftermath of the violence in Charlottesville. The only time we've heard from Sarah Sanders in the last 48 hours is the 30-word statement she put out about Steve Bannon leaving the White House.
Right, and that was a paper statement. She didn't come out. She didn't say anything.
It was emailed out to reporters. She hasn't been on television, and she hasn't met with the press.
Why is that?
Part of it, and you hear this from a lot of members of this administration, is that the president is his own best spokesperson, and he often prefers for his word to be the last. The other part is just how difficult it would be for a spokesperson to go out there and explain these positions in an environment that's really a tinderbox. So your role as a communications staffer can be crippled.
So, did you ever think that this was a position you'd occupy, press secretary?
No, I mean, I've always been probably more on the political side.
Yeah.
And so that's been a bit more of my background. But in that, you do a lot of press and media and communications component, particularly when you're managing campaigns.
Let's talk about Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her background. I don't think most of us had heard of her before she moved into the shop. I really hadn't heard of her at all. What do we know about Sanders?
Well, until now, the most recognizable thing about her was her name. She's the only daughter of Mike Huckabee.
I'm Mike Huckabee. For 10 and a half years, I was governor of Arkansas. I'm from the small town of Hope,
who ran for president as a Republican twice. He won the Iowa caucuses.
I remember that.
She grew up in a political family in the Arkansas governor's mansion, where Bill and Hillary Clinton lived just a few years earlier. Her family had a Yorkie, who's actually buried on the grounds of the governor's mansion, right by the Clintons' old dog.
Wow.
You know, I met children and politicians in my work, and there are some who they want to get as far away from as possible. But it seemed like you sort of dove right in, and I'm just curious about how this fascinated you.
While some kids went to summer camp, I did the Arkansas Festival circuit, and I've been to every county and every county fair and every local diner, and celebrated all things that Arkansas has to celebrate.
Yeah.
I've been there for most of those. I kind of just loved every minute of it and never stopped. For me, it seemed like what everybody does, but I guess, looking back, it was probably not the most normal thing in the world.
The bulk of her experience was actually working for her dad. She ran his Iowa operation in 2008 when he won the caucuses, and then she was a campaign manager in 2016 when he ran again as a Republican candidate.
For President of the United States of America.
And what kind of campaign did he run against Trump that allowed his daughter to leap from his campaign to Trump's campaign?
So if you go back and listen to his comments, Huckabee was actually quite friendly to Donald Trump.
I love Donald Trump. He is a good man. I'm wearing a Trump tie tonight. Get over that one, okay?
And this is a funny thing because Mike Huckabee is a former pastor. His family identifies as evangelical, but he used to talk about Trump as plain-spoken, that he had the right values, and that he appreciated that Trump was someone who could talk to the people at a level that they understood.
Let me tell you, Donald Trump would be a better president every day of the week and twice on Sunday rather than Hillary.
So when Huckabee dropped out, having failed to get much of any support in the primary,
It's because of illness. Obviously, the voters are sick of me, and I need to acknowledge that.
he was one of the first prominent politicians to endorse Donald Trump, to go publicly behind his campaign.
So, how did you decide to come on board?
So, I was running my dad's campaign, and it didn't go so well, and ended in early February. But I got to know President Trump and a few of his family members and some of his staff during my dad's campaign. You're always in back hallways together and in hold rooms at all the, cattle call events that everybody has to go to.
All the debates.
Yeah, all the debates, all that kind of stuff. But I'd also watched President Trump. And there were several things that drew me to the campaign. One, I thought he could win. And two, I thought that he was the disruptor and the change agent that we needed in Washington. Despite the fact my dad had held office, he was very much an outsider, and I liked that about President Trump as well. I liked that he is very direct. He doesn't sugarcoat things, and I thought that was pretty refreshing. He's not always trying to, dance around, and, he's not scripted. And, a lot of those things are very similar to my dad in the sense that, he's a lot more, I guess unscripted is probably the right word, and not controlled or dictated by his staff or his team. And I liked the populist message, very similar to my dad. They have a lot of differences too, but at the same time, I felt like he was what we needed in Washington, was a real shakeup, and I thought he had the chance to beat Hillary Clinton. And it was a gamble that worked.
As you said, her father is a former evangelical pastor. She's a committed Christian. What does she say to you about her relationship with faith?
Well, that it's one of the most important facets of her life.
Certainly would consider myself an evangelical Christian. I think a lot of people want us to separate our faith. For me, that would be very hard to do because my faith defines a lot of who I am. I don't think that means I have to shove it in anybody's face. I'm not trying to go out and replace the Capitol Dome with a steeple or anything crazy. But one of the things I do every day before I go out, I read a little devotional, Jesus Calling, and they're one page, couple paragraphs worth. Something I do just kind of, I think, puts me in the right place before I go, and that's something I do before every briefing.
A way to center yourself.
Yeah, and it gives me a minute to step away from the briefing prep, to step away from everything else, to have just a quiet minute to clear my head before I go out.
So, Michael, this question came up throughout the presidential campaign when it came to Donald Trump, which is, how do evangelicals, many of whom supported Trump, square their faith, and in this case, how does Sarah Huckabee Sanders square her faith with someone like Trump, who's been married 3 times, who's admitted to being unfaithful in marriages, and whose own faith is quite unclear?
When I spoke with her, I asked this directly.
Your father was a former pastor before going into politics. Did any of President Trump's behavior give you pause during the campaign?
Did it what?
Give you pause during the campaign?
My kind of thing, and I answered a lot of these questions at the time, certainly didn't approve of a couple of the comments, but at the same time, we were looking for a commander-in-chief, not a pastor. I had a pastor at my church. That wasn't what I was looking for. I think that oftentimes people want to make politicians perfect, and that's one of the actual beauties of Christianity, is understanding that no one is, and that is what makes us all very similar in that sense. And so you're never going to find anybody that is perfect all the time, but I think you have to look for somebody that you think can do and match up with what you're hoping the direction of the country. And I felt like President Trump was able to do that. And I think he's been successful in that his first 6 months.
So after the election and the surprise victory of Donald Trump, Sarah Huckabee Sanders becomes deputy press secretary.
Good afternoon. As I mentioned yesterday when we spoke, Sean is on reserve duty with the Navy, so you guys are stuck with me for one more day.
In a way, she was the good cop to Sean Spicer's bad cop.
No, wait, how do you know all this? How do you seem to be such an expert in this?
I'm saying that this has been looked at, Sean.
How do you know?
And so then, of course, she becomes a national name all of a sudden, not in the back rooms of the West Wing anymore, when Spicer resigned.
Yeah,
so,
and not on the timeline that I think she ever expected.
You guys heard me in the front, though, right? What I say, John? Sarah's going to be the press secretary, right? Okay, so congratulations to you, Sarah. And so
I think she wanted to work in this White House. I think she saw a role for herself on the press team. I don't think she was expecting to be thrust into the spotlight like that.
What was, when you found out that you were being promoted, what was your reaction? Was it complicated?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I think, a bittersweet moment. I have a great relationship with Sean. I've worked really well with him, and so that part was difficult. At the same time, I think there's a level of excitement to be able to step in. I love the president. I love getting to work for him every day. I love the stuff that we've done over the last 6 months, and I think we're going to do a lot of other great things, and it's hard not to be excited to be part of that.
She had become somewhat close with Sean, I think, being in the trenches day after day. So while she was now at the age of 34, one of the youngest people to ever become White House press secretary, one of the most prominent jobs in American politics, and by the way, only the third woman to become press secretary, and the first mother to become press secretary of the White House. That's a level of political celebrity that I don't think, and she told me this, that she ever expected to achieve.
And it sounds like she didn't really crave.
I do want to ask you, I think this job as press secretary, always a prominent job, is more public now than I can ever remember. And I mean, I've written certainly about Sean. Sean became a celebrity in a way that I don't think really, I can't recall a press secretary kind of getting that level of being known. Are you anxious about that part of the role?
No, I mean, again, my goal is I don't like to be the center. I try to make the president the focal point and his agenda, his priorities, his policies. And so I think you're at the peak. It's kind of hard to be like, no.
Well, I mean,
but you weren't necessarily seeing the enthusiasm you might expect. Sean Spicer, in the last few weeks of his tenure, was trying to interview candidates to replace himself. This is the job that once was the gateway truly to fortunes, to book deals, television contracts, a lifetime of being cited in the public eye as an expert on the presidency.
Right, we think of Ari Fleischer.
Yeah, Dee Dee Myers, Josh Earnest, Robert Gibbs. And here's Sarah Sanders a little reluctantly taking the role. And that really speaks to this moment and how unusual this White House is, where there's such tension with the press and where the press secretary has to come out in public and defend such unorthodox positions that what used to be one of the most desirable roles in D.C. is now something that barely anyone would sign up for.
How's your relationship with him now, or how's it grown?
I mean, I've certainly gotten closer because, now being here and interacting with him a lot more frequent, certainly. I love the president. I think he's a great guy.
She said that I love this president about 3 times in our conversation, which is actually not words you usually hear from a White House aide.
And he's an incredibly personable individual. I think he's more compassionate than people give him credit for.
But talking to people around her and talking to some of the reporters in the West Wing, I got the sense that she kind of enjoyed that behind-the-scenes role, being someone that reporters could turn to in private. And now she has to go out every day knowing that President Trump is watching, because he sits wherever he is with the television and monitors the press briefing.
Right.
And afterwards, he'll send you notes. Other presidents, they care about their press coverage. They care about how they're portrayed in the media. They weren't in the middle of their day taking an hour to watch in real time how their press secretary performed.
Michael, do you think that Sarah Sanders was chosen to some degree in reaction to Sean Spicer? Like, in reaction against or in relation to his personality, to his bombast?
Yeah, look, I think there's no question that she brings down the temperature. Now, the critics of Sarah will say that she gets up there and spins the truth and defends the president as unyieldingly as Spicer did.
Did the president go too far with this tweet in its deeply personal nature?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that the president has been attacked mercilessly on personal accounts by members on that program. And I think he's been very clear that when he gets attacked, he's going to hit back. I think
but in that briefing room, the level of tension has dropped significantly.
When you stepped into the press secretary role, was that one of your priorities to bring down the temperature in that room? Because things had, and I'm not pointing fingers, but things had gotten to a very tense place, I think, in terms of the relationship.
I think that's just my personality, but also maybe, that's how I feel like it's easiest for me to communicate on behalf of the president. I've grown up with the press, in the press, and I've never seen the level of hostility that this press corps has to the president. We may, from the outside, seem more adversarial, but you should see the 100 stories I deal with before going out there. Some of them, some of the most outrageous claims with no facts, no sourcing. It's like an unnamed source, close to the White House. I'm like, what does that mean? The guy that works at the coffee shop across the street? I'm like, you have to give me more than that. And I think we've gotten to probably an unhealthy place where we allow too much to be, unnamed sources. And we fight that a lot every day. And I think that's a tough burden for both sides, and something that, we have to kind of work through and figure out better ways to probably make sure that the actual truth gets out of a story. And that can be a challenge.
To succeed as a spokesperson for Donald Trump, you have to be competent, you have to be loyal, no question. But you can't become the story yourself. You've got to defer to the boss. Mm-hmm. And remember, we saw him undercut Sean Spicer. Spicer goes out and says one thing one day, and the president will say something different the next. So as a spokesperson, to maintain your own credibility with journalists, you got to be flexible. You basically got to just follow his lead, not make waves, answer the questions as best you can, and get out of there quickly.
Michael, you mentioned Sarah Huckabee Sanders' tendency to talk about motherhood, which I think is one of the most striking elements of her tenure so far as press secretary.
I asked her about this, and she said that being a mother is so central to her identity that she feels to be genuine out there at the podium. She has to bring her life with her every day.
You're the first mother to hold the job, and I want to ask how you're holding up with all that.
I guess being a mom helps in some ways prepare you to do something like this, because you have to master multitasking as a parent. Particularly, my kids are still pretty young, and so the press doesn't always like it, but I tell them I'm pretty good at answering the same question over and over, because I have 3 preschoolers that like to ask the same question over and over. But it also gives you lots of patience, which can sometimes be helpful in this job. I think most importantly, though, it makes me like a lot of other people in this country.
Reporters, though, have not reacted uniformly well. They're not charmed by it. And this is one of those really interesting things where it's essentially diversionary to talk about family.
Well, that's right. And there's a lot of grumbling in that press room when she does that. They think it's a distraction. They think it's a cheap trick. She's reading letters from 9-year-olds who write to the president. It's a way to humanize Trump and not have to address some of the questions of the day.
As Anthony said when he was up here last week, we're looking to mix things up a little bit. From time to time, I'd like to give us all a little reminder of why we're here every day, which I imagine for most of us is because we love our country and want to make it better.
You mentioned reading letters from the podium, and I guess you are referring to what has now been described as the pickle incident. So walk me through what happened with that.
Pickle is one of the more surprising celebrities of the last 6 months, I would say.
And today I'd like for you to indulge me and let me tell you a little bit about what that means for me.
It was Sarah Sanders' first official briefing as press secretary.
We're going to start the White House briefing every once in a while with a letter or an email that we may receive from some of those individuals.
And she opened up by reading a letter from a 9-year-old who goes by the nickname Pickle.
Mm-hmm. My name is Dylan Harbin, but everybody calls me Pickle. I'm 9 years old and you're my favorite president. I like you so much that I had a birthday about you. My cake was the shape of your hat. And then Dylan goes on to ask a few questions. How old are you? Dylan, President Trump is 71 years old. How big is the White House? The White House is 168 feet long.
And wanted to know how much money the president had and whether he could come mow the White House lawn.
That's adorable.
How much money do you have? Dylan, I'm not sure, but I know it's a lot. I don't know why people don't like you. Me either, Dylan.
There was immediate suspicion that Pickle was a fake. There were Pickle truthers on Twitter trying to research whether this kid actually existed. And when the White House released an image of the handwritten letter, there were handwriting specialists who tried to see whether the president had written it about himself. Now, the Washington Post, and I have to credit them, tracked down Pickle.
So many were wondering who was behind this letter and if it was even real. And tonight we have learned that the letter was written by a 9-year-old boy.
He's a real kid. He was excited to hear the letter read. And look, Sarah Sanders was able to highlight an American child who idolizes this president.
Yeah, I didn't know it was going to be such a controversy. I was like, who can get mad at a 9-year-old kid? I was like, what has happened in America when a kid writes a very innocent, nice letter and it turns into handwriting specialists and psychologists? I'm like, wait a minute, he's a 9-year-old kid that wrote a letter and had a birthday party, and I thought it was really great. And I mean, his nickname's Pickle. Like, who doesn't want to hear about this? I was just like, I'm so lost that this would be not something celebrated.
Well, tell me first, how did that idea, was it your idea to integrate some correspondence into the briefings?
Yeah, I mean, we get, I have no idea. I have to talk to the correspondence office to get an accurate count, but thousands of letters come into the White House, sometimes great, sometimes not. And some of them are really moving and powerful notes. And I was like, people should see more of this. I mean, I just think sometimes it's nice to take a step back and appreciate things from a 9-year-old perspective. And I think it kind of gives us all a little bit of a calming moment and brings the temperature down a little bit. But one of the things that has been important for the president, certainly something that he's conveyed to us, is he likes to talk directly to the American people.
So when she reads a letter from a 9-year-old who idolizes Donald Trump,
Right, that's not for the reporters in the room.
And wants to come mow the White House lawn. No, it's not for the reporters in the room. In fact, it's a way to remind Trump supporters that they're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a reporter in that room and you're writing about one of the most chaotic administrations in modern history, you don't want a lot of that time to be taken up with essentially propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be having a really tough conversation about the issues.
So I watch these briefings from time to time when they come on in the afternoon or the middle of the morning, and she has a couple of other stock responses that strike me, including, I don't know, I'll have to ask the president.
I'm not aware of that opinion at all. The president's already said that himself. Look, I think it was pretty clear in that original statement. Not that I'm aware of. I don't think so. I don't believe that the president has specifically weighed in that it's right to cut Medicaid. I'm not aware that he accepts certain facts.
There are a surprising number of issues where Sarah Sanders says, I haven't had a chance to discuss this with the president yet. And I think in past administrations, a press secretary would be loath to admit that.
Mm-hmm.
It would suggest that they're not in the inner circle, that they don't have the access that's really the root of their credibility as a spokesperson for the administration. But Sarah's willing to say, hey, I just don't know. And often she says that in response to pretty tricky questions. And it frustrates the reporters in the room.
But it may be a more honest approach.
Exactly. Look, there's certainly self-preservation involved, but it's a way to honestly answer the question. And as much as reporters don't like it, she's not standing up there and lying.
But if her answer is, look at what he said, I haven't asked him, go fish.
Why have a press secretary
what's
at
the
all?
value?
Exactly. And listen, this is a really active debate in Washington journalism circles right now. I mean, the White House briefing, you have to keep in mind, has always been to some degree a Sisyphean exercise. The reporters go in, the press secretary spins them, gives them the most favorable interpretation of some event, but at least you got an official comment from the administration. But you have to ask yourself, at what point are these briefings an exercise in futility? And I don't think that's a question that's going to go away anytime soon.
Oh, someone mentioned to me there was a happy hour earlier this week.
But when I talked to reporters who work in the West Wing, they described a warm relationship with Sarah Sanders.
Obviously, part of this job is balancing your relationship with reporters, and it sounded like it was a fairly what am I trying to say? It sounded like a fun. Yes, that's the word. A fun occasion. So.
And actually, just a few days before our interview, there'd been a happy hour out at a hotel bar in Washington for women in the White House to celebrate her promotion. And there were dozens of female journalists and White House aides who came out. I was told she was the life of the party, stayed out late. Some of the women brought their young children.
Again, I think that we all have a job to do. Yeah. But sometimes you have the ability to spend time outside of the office, and I think that can be helpful for both sides to be able to have a better understanding of who people are, where they come from, maybe why they ask the questions they ask, maybe why we answer the way we do. And so I think it certainly is a helpful part of the process.
Sarah Sanders can't do her job in reality by maligning every reporter she comes into contact with. Her role is to liaise with the press. She has to talk to them off the record. She has to trust them to some degree. and try to do her best to be an advocate for the president. And that involves sometimes going out and having a drink off the record with a reporter. But when it comes time on camera to talk about bias, she's happy to denounce CNN, to go after American news networks. She even told Americans to watch a video by James O'Keefe. Do you remember him? He did the undercover video of Acorn. He's known as a provocateur who edits his footage selectively. She told Americans to go out and watch this video he made of a CNN producer, whether it was accurate or not.
There's a video circulating now, whether it's accurate or not. I don't know, but I would encourage everybody in this room and frankly, everybody across the country to take a look at it.
That was a pretty stunning thing to hear from behind the White House podium.
And the press briefing isn't supposed to be about talking to the press. That's not the purpose of it. That wasn't what it was created for. It was created to provide information so that they could disseminate it to the public. Well, times have changed so much that now everybody can tune into the press briefing if they want to. And so we get to communicate directly to them. And that's the purpose of the press briefing, is to talk about the president, talk about his agenda, and answer questions. And so we have an ability to do that now in a way that's not just the people in the room. That's why.
So she made clear that the purpose of the press briefing is not necessarily about talking to the press. There's a country out there that will see these clips on cable TV, that will see it as the most direct encounter between this White House and journalists.
And is that a new way of approaching the White House briefing, or has it always been so?
You know, President Obama came in for a lot of criticism from the White House press because he would do a podcast interview instead of sitting down with the Washington Post.
I'm pretty much the same guy in a lot of ways.
Yeah?
Yeah, I started keeping a journal when I was around 20.
Or he would go on with Zach Galifianakis and do kind of like a funny skit, and that was their way of communicating to the public.
You know what I would do if I were president, Mr. President? I would make same-sex divorce illegal, then see how bad they want it.
I think that's why you're not president. And that's a good thing.
And the press got pretty pissed about that. It's easy to forget in this time of the ultimate war between president and media. So I think every White House has approached that in different ways. I think what's really irksome to reporters about this press secretary is that they just don't think that basic questions are getting answered.
Is the Trump administration, Michael, forever changing the role of the press secretary?
Yeah, that's a great question. This administration, it feels like a burden to them. They've got to find a way to make it more proactive, more useful to the president. And I think Sarah Sanders and the challenge that she's going to face in the weeks and months ahead is how to make this daily ritual a boon for President Trump instead of a headache. She's got her work cut out for her.
I'm wondering if you approach this new role with excitement, with trepidation, apprehension, and if you could reflect on these last 6 months and one day on what you've learned about how it is to speak for the president. Is it a tough job? Have you found it easy?
I think it's probably certainly professionally, one of the greatest honors that any person could ever have, to work in any capacity within this building, and to get to do that up here in such a public way and speak on behalf of the president is absolutely an honor and something I will cherish and hope to do my very, very best every single day and be as open, honest, and transparent with you all as humanly possible, and will always work to operate at the highest level and certainly with the most amount of integrity as you can. And with that, I think that's a great place to end today, and the president will be having an event here.
Michael Grimberg, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
The New Washington is produced by Michael Simon Johnson and Michaela Bouchard. Brad Fisher is our engineer. Lisa Tobin is our executive producer. Samantha Hennig is our editorial director. Our theme music is by Jim Brunberg and Ben Lansberg of Wonderly. Special thanks to Sam Dolnick and Lindsay Garrison. That's it for The New Washington. See you back here next weekend.